Juan Carlos was a ghost haunting the asphalt arteries of Mexico City. At 50, his identity had merged with the worn-out upholstery of his taxi, a faded yellow Tsuru that knew the metropolis's secrets better than any map. He was a man of few words and many miles, a silent witness to the shady deals on street corners and the desperate whispers in the back seat. For decades, he navigated this concrete jungle with one golden rule: see nothing, hear nothing, get involved in nothing. Protecting himself, and above all, protecting his daughter, was the only commandment that mattered. And before we dive into the hell his life became, I need to ask something of you. If this story resonates with your soul, if this man's journey awakens something in you, please subscribe to the channel. I truly want to reach the goal of 1,000 subscribers to keep bringing stories like this. And comment with the city or country you're listening from, so I know how far these voices are echoing. Juan Carlos's universe had a single son, Sofia. His 17-year-old daughter was the reason his taxi's engine rumbled to life before dawn and only fell silent in the dead of night. She was the vibrant melody that filled the silence of their small apartment, a promise of a brighter future, far from the soot and corruption that stained the streets. His love for her was a quiet but overwhelming force, visible in the way he saved the best piece of bread for her breakfast, or in the extra hours he worked to buy the expensive textbooks for the medical degree she dreamed of. He didn't live for himself. He existed as an orbit around the light Sofia emanated, a dedicated guardian ensuring her flame would never be extinguished, a purpose that gave meaning to his monotonous and resigned existence. Mexico City was a two-headed beast, and Juan Carlos knew both faces intimately. By day, it pulsed with the vibrant energy of markets, the music of mariachis, and the laughter of children in the squares. But at night, under the cloak of neon and shadows, the other face was revealed. It was an underworld ruled by cartels like Los Espectros, a criminal organization that infiltrated every corner of the city, with tentacles reaching from the street vendor to the highest echelons of the police. Juan Carlos saw the halcones watching the streets. He drove men with guns hidden under their coats, and he overheard coded conversations about deliveries and settling scores. He learned to become invisible, to keep his gaze fixed on the road, turning his taxi into a bubble of neutrality in the midst of an undeclared war. He remembered with painful clarity a Sunday afternoon, months before the darkness fell. They were at a street festival in Coyoacán, the air thick with the smell of roasted corn and fresh churros. Sofia, her eyes shining with joy, pulled him into an impromptu dance to the sound of a local band. He, clumsy and shy, resisted at first, but her infectious laughter disarmed him. For a few minutes, under the colorful banners, he wasn't a tired taxi driver, but just a father dancing with the person he loved most in the world. He stored that memory in a vault in his soul, a vivid and luminous image of his happiness, unaware that it would soon become a torturous relic, a ghost of a time when life still had color and warmth. His taxi was a mobile confessional, a transient space where social masks fell away. He heard businessmen planning fraud, lovers ending relationships, corrupt politicians closing deals, and petty criminals bragging about their exploits. He was the silent listener, the nameless face in the rearview mirror. This ability to absorb information without reacting, to blend into the urban landscape like a chameleon, had been his main survival tool for years. He mapped the city not just by its streets, but by the webs of power and fear that connected it. He knew which neighborhoods belonged to which cartel, which cops were on the payroll, and which alleys served as impromptu courts for street justice. Little did he know that all this passive knowledge was accumulating, waiting for a trigger to be turned into a lethal weapon. Sofia's future was the only landscape that mattered to Juan Carlos. Every fare, every tip, was a brick in the construction of her dream. She was a brilliant student, with grades that placed her among the best in her class, and her acceptance into the public university was almost a certainty. He imagined the day he would drop her off at the campus gate, proud, watching her take the first step toward a life he could never have. That hope was his fuel, what made him endure the endless traffic jams, the rude passengers, and the loneliness of the long nights. The promise of her success was a balm for his own frustrations and sacrifices, proof that his humble life would have been worthwhile, culminating in his daughter's fulfillment. The asphalt was his constant companion, a grey ribbon that unspooled endlessly before his eyes. The routine was a hypnotic cycle. The smell of coffee in the morning, the roar of the engine, the hiss of the police scanner, the city lights blurring into colourful streaks at night. He became a master of his craft, not just in navigating the chaotic traffic, but in reading people's intentions, in anticipating danger, in knowing when to accelerate and when to disappear. His life was defined by clear boundaries, those of his car, those of the neighborhoods he avoided, and those of his own morality. He was an ordinary man, a face in a crowd of millions, perfectly anonymous. And it was precisely this anonymity, this ability to go unnoticed, that would become his greatest and most terrible advantage. The last time he saw her alive, the memory burned like a hot coal in his mind. Sophia was at the door, backpack on her way to a study session at a friend's house. She turned, smiled, and said the words that were their daily ritual. "Te amo, papa. I'll be back before 10." He replied with a "Be careful, my daughter," and watched her go down the stairs. It was a mundane moment, an everyday farewell like so many others, and for that very reason it became the cruelest of memories. That smile, that promise of return, would be seared into his retina, replaying in an infinite loop, the silent and innocent prologue to the most brutal and inhuman chapter of his existence, the moment that would divide his life into an irreconcilable before and after. 10 o'clock at night came and went, marked by the distant bell of a church. The anxiety at first, a small needle in his chest, began to expand, turning into a cold claw that gripped his heart. Juan Carlos called Sophia's cell phone. Voicemail. He tried again and again, the electronic sound of the recorded voice echoing like a taunt in his silent apartment. He then called her friend's house, his heart hammering against his ribs. The girl's mother, her voice sleepy and a little annoyed, informed him that the study session had ended early and that Sophia had left around 8, alone. In that instant, the air grew heavy, and every shadow on the street outside seemed to spring to life, transforming the familiar city into a territory of unknown and menacing predators. The night dragged on in a torture of endless minutes. Every passing headlight was a false hope, every distant siren a shot of panic through his nervous system. Unable to bear the stillness, he grabbed his taxi keys. The car, once his livelihood, became an extension of his agony, a yellow projectile cutting through the dark streets in a desperate search. He retraced the route she would have taken, his eyes scanning every corner, every anonymous face on the sidewalk. He called hospitals, describing his daughter in a choked voice, only to receive swift negative replies. The metropolis, which he knew like the back of his hand, had become a monstrous labyrinth that had swallowed his daughter, and he was just an insignificant man lost in its immensity. At dawn, his eyes burning from lack of sleep and unshed tears, he walked into the nearest police station. The place reeked of stale coffee and desperation. The officer behind the counter, a burly man with a stained mustache, barely looked up from his crossword puzzle. Juan Carlos, his voice trembling, reported Sophia's disappearance. The officer cut him off with a yawn, dismissively suggesting that teenagers were like that she had probably run off with a boyfriend and would be home when her money ran out. The humiliation was like a punch to the gut. He was treated not as a terrified father, but as a nuisance. They handed him a clipboard with a form and told him to come back in 48 hours, the standard waiting period to officially file a missing person report. The next 48 hours were a blur of inertia and pain. Time became elastic. Each second an eternity, each hour an unbearable burden. He couldn't work. The thought of having strangers in his car, in the space Sophia had so often occupied, was profane. He remained in his taxi, parked in front of his building, like a guard dog waiting for a master who would not return. The cell phone, once a beacon of hope, was now an object of dread. And then it rang. An unknown number. A deep, bureaucratic voice identified himself as Detective Morales. The words were direct, devoid of any compassion. A body had been found in a vacant lot on the outskirts. The description matched Sophia's. They asked him to come to the morgue to make an identification. The call ended, and the silence that followed was the sound of Juan Carlos's world shattering into 1,000 pieces. The morgue was a place where grief had no sound. The chemical smell of cleaning products tried, unsuccessfully, to mask the odor of death. Juan Carlos followed Detective Morales down a white-tiled hallway, each footstep echoing in the oppressive silence. They stopped before a metal door. Morales asked a question, but Juan Carlos didn't hear it. He just nodded. The metal drawer slid open with a cold shriek. The white sheet was pulled back, and there she was, Sophia. But it wasn't her. It was an empty shell, the light in her eyes extinguished, her skin marked by the brutality of hatred. In that freezing moment, under the fluorescent light that banished all shadows, the tears didn't come. Only an abyssal emptiness opened in his chest. The taxi driver, the father, the resigned man, died right there. In his place, something new and terribly focused began to take shape, forged in the silence of that cold room and in the certainty that justice would not come. It would have to be hunted. The funeral was a parade of faces twisted in shallow pity. Neighbors brought dishes of food he couldn't eat and offered words of comfort that sounded as hollow as cans kicked down an empty street. Detective Morales paid a visit, his tired gaze and defeated posture communicating everything his words didn't. The case would be shelved. The culprits were members of the Los Espectros cartel, and no one would risk a war for a neighborhood girl. In that moment, hearing the system's official resignation, justice became a sick joke. It was there, amidst the smell of cheap funeral flowers, that Juan Carlos's decision solidified. If the world would not give them justice, he would become justice himself. He would no longer seek comfort or help. He would seek blood, the only currency that now made sense. He returned to his taxi, but the vehicle was no longer the same. The passenger seat where Sophia had so often sat was now a shrine and a memorial. The radio, which once played melancholic songs, was replaced by a police scanner that hissed with the city's codes and dispatches. Juan Carlos began to listen differently. The conversations in the back seat, the fragments of street gossip, the names whispered in fear, everything became a piece in his macabre puzzle. His knowledge of the city, once a tool for avoiding traffic, transformed into a tactical map. He was no longer a driver. He was an intelligence gatherer, turning his yellow taxi into a mobile listening post, the nerve center of his one-man war. The first piece fell into his lap during a ride to the airport. A drunk passenger, trying to impress his girlfriend, bragged about his connections, mentioning the name of a street dealer called El Perro for his dog-like loyalty and brutality. The name ignited a feverish memory in Juan Carlos. It was the same nickname he had overheard months earlier from a criminal boasting about having disciplined a stubborn girl. The coincidence was too cruel to be ignored. Thus began the silent hunt. For a week, Juan Carlos became El Perro's shadow. He learned his sales routes, his vices, his schedules. He watched from his taxi parked across the street, the personification of patience and hatred, feeling the ice form in his veins. The idea of taking a life was an abyss that terrified him. On a night of inner turmoil, he drove to Padre Mateo's parish. He didn't enter the confessional, didn't seek forgiveness. He just sat in the back pew of the empty church, the smell of incense and candle wax filling the air. He looked at the figure of the crucified Christ, an image of suffering and sacrifice, and felt no comfort, only a dark kinship. Was he too being crucified by his pain? Vengeance was a mortal sin, he knew. But inaction, silence in the face of the evil that stole his daughter, wasn't that an even greater sin? He left the church, without any answers, only with the conviction that his soul was already lost, and that now all that was left was the path to hell. The preparation was clumsy, the antithesis of any action movie scene. There were no sophisticated firearms. At a hardware store, he bought a tire iron, heavier and more solid than the one in his car, a roll of nylon rope and work gloves. At home, he held the cold metal tool, feeling its weight, imagining the impact, the sound it would make. The thought disgusted him, and he almost gave up. But then his gaze fell on the picture frame on his nightstand. Sophia, smiling at her high school graduation. That smile was all that was left. He took the photo, placed it in the inner pocket of his jacket, over his heart. The memory of her joy became the armor for the monstrosity he was about to commit. The hunt was a choreography of urban knowledge. Juan Carlos knew of a dead-end alley behind a night market, a perfect trap of brick and darkness. Using his taxi, he blocked the narrow street's exit at the exact moment El Perro stepped in to relieve himself against a wall. The confrontation had nothing heroic about it. It was quick, ugly, and desperate. El Perro, caught by surprise, tried to fight back, but the first blow from the tire iron to his knee brought him down. What followed was an explosion of rage that had been contained for decades. Juan Carlos wasn't a trained killer. He was a broken father. Every blow was for one of Sophia's tears. Every impact was a scream from his soul. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of his own ragged breathing. Back in his taxi, the adrenaline dissipated, giving way to an uncontrollable shaking. He leaned his head against the steering wheel, the smell of blood and sweat filling the air. Then he vomited, a violent convulsion that emptied his stomach but not his conscience. He had crossed the line. There was no going back. The image of El Perro's face, twisted in terror and pain, superimposed itself on Sophia's smile. He had killed a man. The brutality of the act shocked him. In his mind, he didn't see his daughter smiling with pride, but rather her face contorted in horror at what he had become. The first step of vengeance brought no relief, only the terrible realization that to destroy a monster, he would have to become one. In the solitude of his apartment, he tried to scrub the filth from his hands in the sink, but the stain was on his soul. He looked in the mirror and saw a stranger. The eyes were the same, but the light in them had been extinguished, replaced by a cold hardness. Do you think I'm a monster? Maybe I am. But when the law turns its back on you and spits on your child's memory, what is left? What they did to her. Wasn't that monstrous? Sometimes, to fight the darkness, you have to become part of it. I'm grateful for every one of you who subscribes and listens, because the strength you give me allows me to tell this truth, no matter how ugly it is. It's proof that Sophia's story and mine will not be forgotten in silence. The next morning's news reported El Perro's death briefly and disinterestedly. The police attributed the murder to a gang-related settling of scores and closed the matter. No in-depth investigation, no search for witnesses. He was just another body in the underworld, unworthy of the system's attention. The invisibility of his act was a revelation to Juan Carlos. He wasn't a suspect, he was a ghost. This realization filled him not with relief, but with a dark and chilling power. He had found a chink in the city's armor. He could operate in the shadows, using the system's own negligence as his shield. The first piece had been removed from the board, and he was already planning his next move. While the police ignored the case, a young journalist named Isabella, working for a small online news blog, sensed there was more to the story. She was idealistic and hungry for a breakthrough piece. The brutality of the murder, committed with a tool and not a firearm, seemed too personal to be a simple gang hit. She started digging, talking to locals, pulling at the loose thread everyone else had ignored. Unknowingly, She lit a small candle in the darkness where Juan Carlos operated, becoming a new and unpredictable threat on his path of revenge. The next target was a step up the ladder in the Los Espectros hierarchy, a loan shark who acted as a middleman, known for his cruelty and use of violence to collect debts. Juan Carlos heard his name on the police scanner, linked to an assault complaint that was conveniently ignored. He began using his work hours to stake out the man's front office. He became more patient, more methodical. The blind rage of the first murder gave way to a cold precision. He was no longer just reacting to his pain. He was becoming a strategist, a hunter who understood that the most dangerous prey requires the most well-crafted trap. This new death, as specific and brutal as the first, finally caught the attention of Detective Morales. 2 known cartel members killed in an unconventional manner in a short period. It wasn't the usual pattern. Gangs used guns. They left messages. This was different. It was personal. Morales, as cynical and weary as he was, had a sharp instinct for anomalies. He began to review the files, to connect the dots no one else saw. The official hunt hadn't begun yet, but a lone, experienced wolf had caught Juan Carlos's scent, and the city, which had seemed so large, was beginning to shrink. For the second murder, Juan Carlos used his taxi as a direct weapon. He studied the loan shark's routine and discovered he always took a poorly lit secondary road to get home late at night. On a night of light rain that made the asphalt slick, Juan Carlos waited. He didn't confront him, he hunted him. On a sharp curve, he accelerated his Tsuru, ramming the back of the loan shark's luxury sedan with the precision of a missile. The car skidded, rolled over and plunged into a small ravine. It looked like a tragic accident caused by speed and bad weather. Juan Carlos didn't stay to see the outcome. He just drove into the night, the sound of twisting metal echoing in his mind. He was evolving, becoming cleaner, more lethal. Soon the streets began to whisper. The deaths no longer went unnoticed in the underworld. The criminals, superstitious by nature, began to talk of a ghost, a shadow that was hunting them. The press, led by the insistent Isabella, picked up on these whispers and gave them a name: El Taxista Justiciero, the Vigilante Cabbie. The legend was born. For the cartels, it was an invisible threat that bred paranoia. For the citizens oppressed by crime, it was a glimmer of hope, an avenging angel born of their own helplessness. Juan Carlos heard the stories about himself in the backseat of his own taxi, a living, anonymous myth, feeling the weight of the monstrous identity he had created. The duality of his new life was tearing him apart. On another nightly visit to the church, he entered the confessional. From the other side of the lattice, Padre Mateo's calm voice invited him to speak. Juan Carlos didn't confess his crimes. Instead, he spoke of an emptiness, of a darkness that was consuming all his happy memories. He asked, his voice choked with emotion, if a soul could die before the body. The priest, sensing the depth of his torment, but not knowing its cause, spoke of forgiveness, of redemption, and warned that the path of vengeance was a labyrinth with no exit, where the only thing found at the end is one's own destruction. Leaving the church, the rain had stopped. He looked at his reflection in a puddle on the sidewalk and for a moment didn't recognize himself. The face staring back was aged, the eyes were pits of exhaustion and something else, something predatory. In that moment, I wondered if there was anything left of the man my daughter had loved, of the father who danced with her at the festival. This is a lonely journey I walk, and knowing you're out there, subscribing, supporting this channel, gives me a reason not to give up on telling this story to the end. Every subscription is a reminder that I'm not completely alone in this darkness. The net was closing in. Morales, following his gut, set up a discreet surveillance on the territory of the third potential target. Juan Carlos, on his hunt, didn't notice the trap until the last second. He saw the subtle glint of binoculars in a car across the street. Panic hit him, but instead of speeding away, he used his mask of normalcy. He turned on his for-hire light, pretended to be just another driver looking for a fare, and slowly pulled away. A silent chase ensued. Morales followed him, but Juan Carlos knew shortcuts that weren't on any map. He plunged into a labyrinth of alleys, killed his headlights, and vanished into the darkness, his heart pounding, one step away from being caught. The pressure, Juan Carlos exerted from the outside, began to cause cracks within Los Espectros. The precise killings led the leader, Ricardo El Silencio Vargas, to believe there was a traitor in his ranks. Paranoia set in. Accusations flew, and the cartel's internal violence exploded. Low-level members began to disappear, executed on suspicion of betrayal. Juan Carlos, in his quest for revenge, had become an unwitting catalyst, accelerating the self-destruction of the organization he hated. He was destabilizing the enemy, making them more erratic and dangerous. Meanwhile, Isabella's investigation led her to the neighborhoods where the victims operated. She was persistent, and her sincerity earned her the trust of some of the fearful residents. An old street vendor who knew El Perro mentioned seeing an old, beat-up yellow Tsuru taxi parked on the corner for several days before the dealer's death. It was a small lead, almost insignificant in the vastness of Mexico City and its fleet of thousands of taxis. But for Isabella, it was the first concrete description of the ghost. She now had a focus, and her search for a face to put to the legend set her on a direct collision course with the dangerous truth. Through an intercepted police radio conversation about a body found with signs of internal cartel torture, Juan Carlos finally heard the name at the top of his list. The name Detective Morales had avoided saying at the morgue: Ricardo El Silencio Vargas, the architect of his pain. He knew that getting to a man like Vargas, protected by layers of henchmen and influence, would be different. It couldn't be a dark alley or a staged accident. It would require a bolder plan, a move that would expose him completely. The hunt was reaching its apex, and he would have to dive headfirst into the serpent's nest. The opportunity arose in a risky way. He needed information on El Silencio's routine, details that weren't whispered on the streets. Using his harmless appearance, he began frequenting a taxi stand near one of the luxury restaurants Vargas used as an office. For days, he watched. Finally, he got his chance. One of Vargas's top lieutenants left the restaurant, talking loudly on his cell phone, and got into Juan Carlos's taxi. Throughout the entire ride, Juan Carlos drove in silence, while the man, arrogant and careless, discussed details of a delivery at an abandoned warehouse in the industrial zone, the exact time and place of Vargas's next big deal. Frustrated by the lack of progress in his own investigation, Detective Morales changed tactics. Instead of hunting the vigilante, he decided to re-examine the victims. What connected them? Digging through dusty files, he found the link. All the dead men had been mentioned, however peripherally, in the investigation of a young woman's kidnapping and murder. Her name was Sophia. The case had been closed as unsolved. Morales pulled the file on the girl's father, a 50-year-old taxi driver named Juan Carlos. The profile was a perfect fit. The detective finally had a name and a face for the ghost that was haunting the city. The mention of the warehouse in the henchman's conversation lit a cold fire in Juan Carlos. He knew the place. It was in the same area where Sophia's body had been found. The coincidence was a punch to the gut, a cruel signature of fate. That desecrated ground, the site of his daughter's final suffering, would be the stage for his revenge. It was no longer just about killing Vargas. It was about symbolism. It was about cleansing that soil with the blood of the man responsible for its profanation. The final plan began to take shape in his mind, not as an attack strategy, but as a script for a final act of poetic and terrible justice. With every step he took toward the final confrontation, he felt pieces of himself flaking away. The happy memories of Sophia, once his fuel, were now tainted, distant, like faded photographs. In his nightmares, he no longer saw her smile, but the terrified eyes of the men he had killed. He stopped eating, sleeping. He operated in a state of pure, exhausted determination, moved only by the image of El Silencio's face. The transformation was nearly complete. He was no longer a father seeking revenge. He was vengeance itself, a hollow and relentless force, emptied of everything but his single, terrible purpose. On a cold night, he parked his taxi for the last time, a few blocks from his apartment. The car, which had been his home, his weapon and his refuge, now seemed like the coffin of his former life. He cleaned the interior as if preparing a body for burial. In his apartment, he wrote a short letter and put it in an envelope addressed to Padre Matteo. It was not a request for forgiveness, for he knew he was beyond that. It was an explanation, the final testimony of a man who was about to erase himself. With the letter in his pocket and the tire iron in his hand, he walked out into the night, not to hunt, but for his final sacrifice. He knew he wouldn't be coming back. The warehouse was a skeleton of metal and concrete, an industrial mausoleum on the forgotten edge of the city. The air was heavy with the smell of rust, mold, and the memory of rain. Juan Carlos moved through the shadows with a ghostly familiarity. He was no longer a stranger in this place. He was its genius loci, its avenging spirit. His first act was not of violence, but of strategy. With a heavy pair of pliers, he cut the power cables, feeding the complex, plunging the perimeter into near-total darkness. Inside the main hangar, only the weak, battery-powered emergency lights cast a sickly glow on the cement floor, creating pools of light and vast oceans of shadow. He wasn't attacking the enemy's fortress, he was turning it into his own hunting ground. Ricardo El Silencio Vargas arrived with an entourage of 4 men, their headlights cutting through the darkness before being abruptly switched off. The power outage made them immediately tense. They entered the warehouse with guns drawn, their footsteps echoing in the cavernous silence. It was then that Juan Carlos's performance began. The sound of metal falling in a distant corner made 2 of the men split from the group. It was the last time they were seen. Juan Carlos used the labyrinth of crates and rusted machinery, moving with the lightness of a spectre. He didn't use a gun. He used the rope, the tire iron, the element of surprise. The henchmen were eliminated. One by one, in silence, dragged into the shadows that now belonged to the cabbie. Finally, only the 2 of them remained. Juan Carlos emerged from the shadows, stopping in a pool of yellowish light, his face a mask of exhaustion and determination. El Silencio, unlike his men, showed no fear. There was a cold curiosity in his eyes. He studied this older, ordinary-looking man who had single-handedly dismantled his guard. "So it's you," Vargas said, his voice calm and controlled. "The ghost. I must admit I'm impressed, but all this trouble, why? Money? Power? What could a man like you possibly want from me?" The question hung in the air, a psychological duel beginning even before any physical confrontation, the arrogance of power blind to the fury of grief. Vargas's words, his inability to even conceive of a personal reason for this war, were the final fuel for Juan Carlos's fire. He took a step forward, the tire iron hanging by his side. For the first time in months, he gave his pain a voice. "You don't remember her, do you? To you, she was just a number, collateral damage in your dirty business." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the worn photograph of Sophia. He held it at the edge of the light, her smile a beacon of innocence in that profane place. Her name was Sophia. She wasn't insignificant. She was my world, and you destroyed it. The statement was not a cry of rage, but a death sentence delivered with a terrible calm. The mention of Sophia and the sight of the photo seemed to amuse El Silencio. "Ah, the girl," he said with a shrug. "She was stubborn, a regrettable mistake." That casual cruelty snapped the last thread of Juan Carlos's control. He surged forward, not with a shout, but with a guttural roar, a father's pain transformed into raw force. The fight was desperate and ugly. Vargas was younger and stronger, but Juan Carlos was driven by something primal. They crashed against crates, rolled on the filthy floor. Juan Carlos felt a knife slash. His arm, the sharp pain only focusing him more. In a final burst of effort, he used his body weight to pin Vargas down, finally subduing him. He raised the tire iron, the metal gleaming in the dim light, ready for the final blow, to close the circle of his suffering. In that exact instant, the wail of sirens pierced the night, growing rapidly louder. Red and blue lights pulsed through the broken windows, sweeping the warehouse interior in strobing flashes. Outside, Detective Morales' amplified voice boomed, metallic and imperative. "Mexico City Police, the building is surrounded. Drop the weapon and come out with your hands up." Juan Carlos froze, the tire iron hovering in the air. He was trapped between the end of his vengeance and the beginning of his condemnation. Justice, in the form of the law that had abandoned him, had arrived too late, offering him an impossible choice: hand the monster over to the corrupt system or become a monster killer in the eyes of the world. On the floor, Ricardo Vargas began to laugh, a low, confident sound, even with his bloody face. "You hear that, cabby?" he spat, a sneer forming on his lips. "That's the sound of my freedom. My lawyers will have me out of here by sunrise. You'll rot in prison. You've accomplished nothing." That smirk, that arrogant certainty of impunity, was the final desecration. Juan Carlos looked from the face of the man who took everything from him to the flashing lights that represented a broken world. There was no justice there, no hope. With a terrible clarity and a grim peace, he made his choice. He was no longer killing out of rage. He was erasing a mistake. Ignoring Morales' shouts, he brought the tire iron down with all his strength in a final, deliberate act. His mission was accomplished. There was no struggle, no resistance. With the final act consummated, the force that drove him dissipated, leaving behind only the hollow shell of a man. Juan Carlos dropped the tire iron, the sound of metal striking concrete echoing like the final punctuation of his story. The beams of flashlights blinded him. The voices shouting orders were a distant, meaningless noise. He felt the cold of handcuffs on his wrists, the pressure of hands forcing him against the hood of a police car. His eyes met Detective Morales's for a brief instant. In the cop's face, there was no triumph, only a deep, weary exhaustion. Juan Carlos had become the final piece of the puzzle the detective had hunted for so long, the monster at the end of the labyrinth. He was led away in silence, leaving the carnage and the silenced evil behind him. The story of the vigilante cabbie exploded in the media, instantly becoming an urban legend. Juan Carlos was transformed into a complex and contradictory symbol. To the elite and the government, he was proof of anarchy, a dangerous murderer who subverted order. But in the poor neighborhoods, on the streets where Los Espectros had reigned with fear, his name was whispered with reverence. Murals of a stylized yellow taxi began to appear on walls. He became a folk saint for the dispossessed, an avenging angel who gave voice to the silent fury of a people abandoned by the law. The journalist Isabella wrote the story of her career, portraying him not as a hero or a villain, but as the inevitable consequence of a broken system, an ordinary man consumed by the failure of his own institutions. Years later, in a quiet prison cell, Juan Carlos received a visit from Padre Mateo. Time had deepened the lines on both their faces. There were no words of condemnation or absolution. The priest simply sat with him, a silent act of companionship. He mentioned the letter, saying he understood. Juan Carlos, for the first time, spoke of what he felt. It wasn't remorse for what he'd done, but an infinite sorrow for who he had become. He had cut out the cancer that killed his daughter, but the surgery had left him mutilated, empty. Vengeance had given him purpose, but it had not brought him peace. The silence that followed El Silencio's death was just as hollow and desolate as the silence that followed Sophia's. The legend, however, lives forever. Even today, on rainy Mexico City nights, some swear they see an old yellow Tsuru taxi roaming aimlessly through the dark streets, its for hire light on, but never stopping for anyone. Is it him? Did he escape? Or is it just the memory of his pain, now etched into the city's asphalt? And so, his story ends. Or, perhaps, it never truly does, echoing in every act of desperation against injustice. If this tale touched your soul, if this father's journey made you reflect on the line between justice and revenge, your subscription to this channel ensures that voices like Juan Carlos's and memories like Sophia's are not lost to oblivion. The ghost taxi, real or imagined, continues its journey, a yellow blur in the darkness, until it merges with the thousands of other city lights and disappears. The rain falls, washing the sidewalks, but some stains never come out. The city moves on, an indifferent organism that continues to pulse, to create, and to destroy. The story of Juan Carlos offers no easy lesson. It is a dark reflection in a rain-streaked windshield, showing that when institutions fail, men are forced to make terrible choices. He fulfilled his vengeance, but the passenger seat of his soul will remain forever empty. He became the ghost in his own city, an eternal driver on a journey with no destination.